Don't do it." But the rancher did, and he lived to regret it. John Harris had spent his entire life working the land. From the moment he could walk, he had been on the ranch, learning how to ride, how to care for cattle, how to mend fences, and how to survive the harsh Montana weather. He knew every inch of his property, or at least he thought he did. The wide open fields, the rolling hills, the thick forests, and the occasional rocky outcrops were his world, and he moved through it with the confidence of a man who had spent decades in close company with the earth. People in the nearby town often admired John for his independence and toughness. He was the kind of man who could handle almost anything the wilderness threw at him. Over the years, he had faced snowstorms, wildfires, and rattlesnakes. He had rescued stranded livestock in the dead of winter and repaired fences in the middle of thunderstorms. Most neighbors considered him fearless. Some even said reckless. But John didn't see it that way. To him, he was careful, knowledgeable, and capable. Yet, despite all his experience, there were parts of his land that even he approached with caution. One area in particular had always unsettled him. The old ravine near the far edge of his property. It was a deep, narrow split in the earth, with jagged rocks and uneven ground that made it dangerous to cross. The ravine had been there long before John was born, carved out by centuries of water and erosion, and it seemed to have a presence of its own. He often avoided going near it, not because he was afraid, but because it seemed unpredictable, almost alive. One evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, John was repairing a broken fence with his son, Michael. The two of them worked quietly, the rhythm of hammering and tying wire echoing across the quiet ranch. Michael was a teenager now, tall and strong, but he had inherited none of his father's reckless confidence. He respected the land, the way it could give life and take it away, and he often urged caution when they worked together. As they finished repairing the last section, a neighbor's voice called across the fields. It was old Mr. Simmons, a farmer who lived a few miles down the road. "John! Ha! Don't do it!" he shouted, his voice carrying urgency. John looked up, squinting against the sunset. "What's that, old man?" he called back. "Stay away from that ravine. I've been telling you for years, you can't trust it. It's dangerous, especially this time of year." John's lips curled into a small, amused smile. Mr. Simmons had always been a worrier, and John had learned to ignore most of his warnings. But something in the old man's tone made him pause just for a moment. "I've been here longer than anyone," John said casually. "I know what I'm doing. That ravine hasn't hurt me yet, and it won't." Still, Mr. Simmons waved his hands, emphasizing every word. "I'm telling you, John, it's treacherous. Rocks shift, the soil is unstable, and if you fall, there's no saving you." John shook his head, returning to the fence. He didn't mean to sound rude, but he had heard these warnings many times before. Life on a ranch meant taking some risks, and he had always trusted his instincts over hearsay. "Thanks for the concern, Mr. Simmons," he said lightly, "but I can handle it. I've got eyes in my head and hands that know what they're doing." Michael, however, glanced nervously toward the far edge of the property. "Dad," he said softly, "maybe we should just leave it alone. It's getting late, and it's not really necessary to check that part right now." John looked at his son, appreciating the concern, yet feeling a surge of stubbornness rise inside him. He had been raised to face challenges head-on, never to back down out of fear. He also felt a strange pull toward the ravine, as if it were calling to him, daring him to test his skill and courage. "I know what I'm doing, Michael," he said firmly. "Sometimes you have to go where others won't, or you'll never know what's out there." As the sun sank lower, the sky turned deep orange and purple, casting long shadows across the fields. The ranch, usually calm and peaceful, seemed alive with anticipation. The wind picked up, rustling the tall grass and carrying a faint, almost whispering sound from the direction of the ravine. It was the kind of evening that made people pause and take notice, though John ignored it, believing it to be just the wind playing tricks on him. That night, John couldn't sleep. His mind kept returning to the ravine. He imagined himself standing on its edge, looking down into the darkness below, feeling the thrill of having faced danger and survived. His pride whispered that he was capable, that he was strong enough to navigate any challenge. Yet another voice, quieter and more instinctual, warned him of real danger. But John, accustomed to listening to reason and confidence over fear, dismissed it. By the next morning, his decision was made. He would ride to the ravine, not recklessly, but deliberately, as a man who trusted his own judgment. He prepared his horse, a sturdy brown stallion named Buck, checking the saddle and reins with care. Buck had been with John for years, and their bond was strong. The horse knew its owner's moods and trusted him just as much as John trusted the horse. As John rode toward the edge of the property, the wind was brisk, carrying the scent of dry grass and earth. Birds scattered from the trees, startled by the sudden movement of the horse. Each step brought him closer to the ravine, and with every passing moment, a mix of excitement and tension grew inside him. He remembered Mr. Pa, Simmons's warning, Michael's concerned eyes, and even his own fleeting moments of doubt. But he kept riding, certain that he was making the right choice. When he finally reached the ravine, the sight took his breath away. The deep chasm split the land, shadows clinging to the jagged rocks as the sun rose behind the hills. Water from a hidden stream glimmered far below, winding its way through the canyon like a silver ribbon. The beauty was undeniable, but the danger was equally clear. One misstep, one unstable rock, and it could all end in disaster. John dismounted, patting Buck on the neck and whispering reassuring words. He studied the edge carefully, feeling the texture of the soil with his boots, testing his footing. The ground seemed solid, but he knew that appearances could be deceiving. The wind whispered through the trees and rocks, carrying a cautionary message he chose not to heed. In that moment, John felt a mixture of pride and hubris. He had faced danger before, survived it, and learned from it. Yet this was different. The ravine was older, wiser, and indifferent to human skill. It was not just an obstacle. It was a force of nature, and John, for all his confidence, had yet to understand it fully. As he stood there, looking down into the depths, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested. Every instinct told him to step back, to listen to the warnings that had echoed in his ears the night before. But John's pride would not allow him to retreat. He was the rancher, the man who knew his land, and he would face this challenge no matter the cost. Little did he know, this decision, the choice to ignore the warnings, to step closer to the ravine, would mark the beginning of a series of events that would change his life forever. That very edge, so deceptively calm and beautiful, held a danger that no amount of experience could completely prepare him for. And as the wind blew and the shadows danced around him, John Harris took his first step toward a moment he would never forget. John Harris stood at the edge of the ravine, the wind tugging at his jacket and carrying a faint chill that hinted at the approaching morning. The shadows of the jagged rocks stretched across the ground like long, dark fingers, reaching for the earth below. John's eyes traced the uneven path along the side of the ravine, where stones jutted out at odd angles and small patches of soil looked loose and fragile. To anyone else, it might have seemed too dangerous to even step near, but to John, it was a challenge, one he was determined to face. He glanced back toward the ranch where the sun was just beginning to rise over the rolling hills. The golden light spilled across the fields, making the tall grass shimmer like a sea of gold. For a moment, the beauty of the morning reminded him why he loved this land so much. It was untamed, alive, and full of surprises. Yet even in that beauty, there was danger hiding in plain sight. Every rock, every crevice, every sudden drop could become a trap if he wasn't careful. John took a deep breath and adjusted his grip on the reins of his horse, Buck. The horse shifted nervously, snorting and stamping a hoof on the rocky ground. John patted him gently. "Easy, boy," he said softly. "We've got this. Just take it slow." Buck seemed to understand, calming slightly under John's hand, though the tension in the air was undeniable. The decision to move closer to the ravine was not made lightly. There. John had spent a lifetime reading the land, learning to notice the subtle signs that most people missed. He could tell where the soil was soft or firm, where water might seep through, and where a rock could give way under his weight. Today, however, the ravine seemed to challenge even his skills. There was a strange feeling, almost like the land was testing him, daring him to cross its edge. John led Buck carefully along the narrow path that hugged the side of the ravine. The horse's hooves crunched against the loose gravel, sending small rocks tumbling down the slope into the shadows below. John kept his eyes focused on the path ahead, scanning for any sign of danger. Every step required attention. Every movement was deliberate. One misstep, one lapse in judgment, and the consequences could be severe. As they moved, memories of the previous evening's warnings returned to John. Mr. Simmons's voice echoed in his mind. Don't do it, John." And his son Michael's worried expression haunted him as well. John had ignored them both, believing in his own experience and skill. But now, standing at the edge of the ravine, he realized that experience alone might not be enough. The land was unpredictable, and even the most skilled rancher could be caught off guard. The path narrowed further, forcing Buck to walk single file along the edge. John felt his heart rate increase slightly, a mix of excitement and tension running through him. He had always enjoyed challenges, the thrill of testing his abilities. But there was a difference between calculated risk and reckless danger. Today, the line between the two seemed dangerously thin. He stopped for a moment, letting Buck catch his breath, and surveyed the ravine. The drop was steep, the rocks jagged and unforgiving. He could see small plants clinging to the cliffside, their roots holding fast to cracks in the stone. Below, the stream glimmered like a ribbon of silver, twisting through the canyon in sharp turns and hidden bends. It looked beautiful, serene even, but John knew better. Water had carved this ravine over centuries, shaping it with a quiet, unstoppable power. It was a reminder that nature always had the upper hand, no matter how skilled or strong a human might be. With a steadying breath, John urged Buck forward. Step by step, they moved along the edge. He kept one hand on the reins, the other occasionally brushing against the horse's neck to keep him calm. The wind whispered past them, carrying the scent of damp earth and dry grass. Every sound seemed louder here, the distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves, the faint trickle of the stream far below. John felt a strange awareness of every detail, as if the ravine itself had heightened his senses. As they advanced, John noticed the path becoming more treacherous. Rocks shifted under Buck's hooves, some cracking and settling with unsettling sounds. The soil appeared softer in places, almost as if it could give way at any moment. John paused, crouching slightly to test the ground with his boot. It held firm, but only barely. His instincts told him to proceed with extreme caution. Yet despite the danger, there was a part of him that wanted to push forward, to see what lay beyond the next curve in the path. It wasn't just curiosity, it was pride, the kind that comes from a lifetime of proving oneself capable. John had faced storms, predators, and wild terrain before, and he had always come out on top. Today, he told himself, would be no different. Buck hesitated for a moment, sensing the instability of the ground beneath him. John spoke softly, encouraging him, praising him for his courage. The horse moved carefully, one step at a time, guided by his owner's steady hand and calm voice. John felt a surge of gratitude for Buck, knowing that the horse's trust in him was as strong as his own confidence in the animal. Together, they seemed to form a small team against the challenge of the ravine. Hours passed as they moved along the edge, the sun climbing higher in the sky. The shadows shifted and stretched, changing the appearance of the rocks and making the path seem even more uneven. John's muscles ached from constant tension, and his eyes strained to follow every detail. Yet he pressed on, driven by determination and the quiet thrill of overcoming the challenge. Occasionally, he stopped to rest, letting Buck graze on small patches of grass that grew near the edge. These moments of calm allowed John to reflect on the warnings he had ignored, the voices that had urged him to stay away. He realized that caution was not a sign of weakness, but a form of respect for the land, for life, and for the unpredictable forces that could change everything in an instant. Despite this realization, he continued, there was a stubbornness in John, a refusal to turn back once he had made up his mind. He felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, knowing that every step carried risk but also the possibility of mastery over the dangerous terrain. It was a test, he told himself, of skill, patience, and courage. As the afternoon approached, John reached a particularly narrow section of the path. The edge dropped sharply with loose rocks scattered along the way. Buck's hooves slipped slightly, sending a few stones tumbling into the ravine below. John steadied him immediately, whispering words of reassurance. The horse calmed, but the tension in the air was unmistakable. The ravine seemed to loom larger now, more imposing, as if it had taken notice of their presence. John's mind raced. Every warning, every cautionary thought returned in full force. He remembered Mr. Call, Simmons's words, Michael's worried eyes, and even his own fleeting doubts from the night before. But he also remembered the pride that had driven him this far, the years of experience that told him he could handle the challenge. He had to balance caution with confidence, fear with skill. Finally, after what felt like hours, John and Buck reached a slightly wider area, a plateau that allowed them to rest more comfortably. John dismounted, letting the horse graze and catch his breath. He sat on a rock, taking in the view of the ravine below. The stream glimmered, the plants clung stubbornly to the cliffside, and the wind carried a sense of quiet power. He felt a mixture of awe and respect, realizing that the ravine was more than just a physical obstacle. It was a force of nature that demanded attention, humility, and careful thought. John knew that the real challenge was not over. The path ahead remained narrow and dangerous, and one misstep could lead to disaster. Yet he also knew that turning back now would leave him with regret, a sense that he had not faced the full test of his abilities. With a deep breath, he prepared to continue, determined to face whatever lay ahead with caution, skill, and courage. The narrow path along the ravine had grown even more treacherous by the time John Harris continued forward. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. The loose rocks shifted under Buck's hooves, and the soil seemed less stable than before. John's heart beat faster with each careful step, a mixture of tension and determination coursing through him. He could feel the edge of the ravine close to him, the sheer drop below both terrifying and mesmerizing. The wind picked up, whistling through the rocks and trees, carrying the faint, steady sound of water flowing far below. John paused, letting Buck catch his breath and scanning the path ahead. The next section of the trail narrowed sharply, barely wide enough for the horse to pass. One wrong move here, he knew, and the consequences could be serious. Yet the pride that had driven him this far would not let him turn back. John leaned close to Buck, whispering reassuring words. The horse snorted and shifted his weight, sensing the tension in the air. John could feel his own muscles tightening with the strain of keeping balance. Every nerve in his body seemed focused on the fragile path before him. He had been careful, aware of the danger, yet a quiet voice of unease whispered in the back of his mind. As they moved forward, the loose rocks underfoot made small sliding noises, sending pebbles clattering down the steep slope. John's eyes followed each one, imagining how easily a larger rock could give way under their weight. He urged Buck to take slow, careful steps, keeping him close to the stable inner edge of the path. The horse obeyed, stepping lightly, ears flicking back and forth as he listened to the sounds of the ravine. John tried to focus on the task, but his thoughts drifted briefly to Mr. Simmons and his warnings. Don't do it, John." He shook his head. Experience had taught him to weigh advice carefully, but it had also taught him that fear often came from uncertainty rather than actual danger. He reminded himself that he had crossed difficult terrain before and survived. Today would be no different. But the ravine seemed determined to challenge him. The path narrowed even further, rocks jutting out sharply, making each step a test of balance. Buck's hooves slid slightly again, and John's heart jumped. He steadied the horse with a gentle tug on the reins, leaning his weight toward the safer side of the path. Buck shivered slightly but remained calm, trusting his owner. John paused, crouching to inspect a particularly unstable patch of soil. The earth was crumbly, loose under the weight of a single foot. He could see how easily it could give way. For the first time, he considered turning back. The rational part of his mind warned that the ravine was no longer a simple obstacle. It was a serious hazard, one mistake away from disaster. But the stubbornness that had brought him this far kept him moving. Step by careful step, they advanced. The edge of the ravine was now only a few inches from Buck's hooves, and John's pulse raced with every movement. The wind gusted suddenly, shaking loose small stones and stirring dust into the air. John instinctively shifted his weight to keep balance, whispering calm words to Buck. The horse responded, steadying himself with careful steps. Then, as they reached the narrowest point of the path, a sudden slip changed everything. A patch of loose soil beneath Buck's front hooves gave way. The horse stumbled, one leg sliding dangerously close to the edge. John's heart leapt into his throat. He grabbed the reins with both hands, leaning back to counter the shift in weight, but the ground beneath him shifted too. A loud crack sounded as a larger rock dislodged and tumbled into the ravine below. John's instincts kicked in. He leaned hard, trying to keep both himself and Buck safe. The horse snorted, panicked, and tried to regain footing, but another small rock shifted beneath him. In a terrifying instant, John felt himself losing balance. His hands scrabbled for something solid to grab, but there was nothing. The slope was too steep, the edge too unstable. Time seemed to stretch. John's mind raced through every possibility, every memory of survival, every lesson learned from years on the ranch. He remembered Michael's worried eyes, Mr. Simmons' urgent warnings, and even his own fleeting doubts from the night before. But there was no time to think. only to act. Buck struggled, slipping further toward the ravine. John leaned with all his strength, trying to pull the horse back onto firmer ground. His boots dug into the loose soil, but the earth shifted beneath him again, making each movement more precarious. The edge crumbled slowly, rocks tumbling down into the darkness. Then, in a heart-stopping moment, John's grip on the reins loosened. He slipped, one hand barely holding on to a jutting rock, while the other reached desperately for something to hold. Buck scrambled, and for a second, it seemed as if both horse and rider might fall into the deep ravine below. John's mind raced, thinking of survival. He knew that panic could make the situation worse. He focused on his breathing, on steadying himself, and on finding a solid hold. Slowly, painstakingly, he shifted his weight, moving his feet toward a slightly more stable patch of ground. Buck's hooves found better footing as well, and the horse calmed slightly under John's steady commands. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a point where the path widened enough for safer footing. John's hands shook as he patted Buck, murmuring reassurances. Both of them were safe, for now, but the experience had left a mark. John could feel every muscle tense, his heart still racing, and a deep, humbling awareness of the power of the ravine settled over him. He realized in that moment that experience and skill could only take him so far. Nature had its own rules, and no amount of knowledge or confidence could completely eliminate risk. The ravine was not something to conquer. It was something to respect, to navigate carefully, and to treat with caution. John sat on a nearby rock, letting Buck graze and recover from the ordeal. He examined his hands and clothes, checking for injuries, but thankfully they were mostly unharmed. The emotional impact, however, was far greater. Fear, relief, and a newfound respect for the land mixed together inside him, leaving him quiet and reflective. As he sat there, John thought about how easily things could have gone wrong. One slip, one misjudgment, and he might have been seriously injured, or worse. He thought of his son Michael, who would have been devastated to lose his father in such a preventable way. He thought of Mr. Greer, Simmons, who had only wanted to protect him. The warnings he had ignored now rang clear in his mind. Caution is not weakness, it is wisdom. Hours passed as John and Buck rested, the sun climbing higher and warming the rocky path. John looked down into the ravine, where the stream glimmered far below, unaware of the near disaster that had just occurred. The beauty of the landscape was undeniable, but now it carried a deeper lesson. The ravine was dangerous, yes, but it was also magnificent, a testament to the power and persistence of nature. John understood that facing it without respect could have ended tragically. When he finally stood, ready to continue along the safer path back to the ranch, John felt a mixture of relief and humility. He had survived the encounter, but he had also learned something vital. Arrogance could not guide a man safely through the wild. Knowledge, patience, and respect for the land were far more important than pride or stubbornness. John led Buck carefully down the rest of the trail, making sure every step was deliberate. The tension in the air began to ease slightly, though a quiet alertness remained. He knew that the experience would stay with him forever, a reminder that danger often lurks where it is least expected, and that even the most skilled and confident people must respect it. By the time John reached the wider, safer part of his property, the sun had fully risen. The morning light painted the ranch in golden hues, and the wind had calmed. John dismounted and patted Buck, whispering words of gratitude to the horse. Both of them had survived a terrifying ordeal, and though the fear lingered, so did a profound sense of relief and newfound understanding. John Harris had faced the ravine and lived to tell the tale. But the near disaster had changed him. The pride that had pushed him forward was tempered now with respect, caution, and humility. He knew that the land demanded not just skill, but careful attention and a willingness to listen to warnings. Today, he had survived, but the memory of the edge, the slipping rocks, and the near fall would remain with him forever. After the terrifying experience at the edge of the ravine, John Harris returned to his ranch with Buck, the horse that had saved him from disaster. The ride back was quiet, the only sounds being the soft clop of hooves against the ground and the rustle of the morning wind through the tall grass. The ranch, which had always felt like a place of control and confidence for John, now seemed different. It felt fragile, as if the earth itself had reminded him that life could change in an instant. As they reached the main fields, John dismounted slowly. He ran his hands over Buck's mane, patting the horse gently. "Good boy, Buck," he murmured. "We made it." Buck nickered softly, seeming to understand, his eyes calm and steady. The horse had been more than a companion today. He had been a lifeline, a partner in surviving the dangerous edge of the ravine. Buck and Dad, John realized that no matter how skilled or experienced he was, some challenges could not be faced alone. John walked toward the barn, each step deliberate, his muscles aching from the strain of the morning. The near disaster had left him physically tired and emotionally drained. His hands, once steady and sure, still trembled slightly as he adjusted his jacket. Every small movement reminded him of the moments when the ground had shifted beneath him, when Buck had struggled for footing, and when he had nearly fallen into the abyss. The memory sent shivers down his spine, and he knew he would not soon forget it. Inside the barn, he began checking the equipment, making sure everything was intact and functional. The saddle had shifted during the struggle along the ravine. The reins had been stretched taut, and a few tools had fallen from the racks. John handled each item carefully, his mind focused on the details. It was a simple task, but it gave him a sense of control after the morning's chaos. In a way, it felt like a way of grounding himself, of reconnecting with the familiar after an encounter with danger that had reminded him how fragile life could be. Later, John went to find his son, Michael. The boy had been tending the smaller animals near the farmhouse, keeping a careful eye on the chickens and pigs. When Michael saw John approaching, he dropped the basket of eggs and ran toward him. "Dad!" he exclaimed, worry evident in his voice. "Are you okay?" "I was so worried." John knelt and hugged his son. "I'm all right, Michael," he said softly. "It was dangerous, but we made it."
Buck and I are fine. Michael's eyes were wide, a mix of relief and lingering concern.
He looked at his father, noticing the weariness in his movements and the deep lines of concentration on his face. "You shouldn't have gone there, Dad," Michael said quietly.
"You could have been hurt, or worse."
John nodded slowly. He understood his son's worry. "You're right," he said, his voice serious. "I was too proud. I ignored warnings, and I took a risk that I shouldn't have. Today reminded me that experience isn't enough to make someone invincible. Nature always has the final say." Michael stayed close, holding his father's hand. The bond between them had always been strong, built on years of working together on the ranch. But today, it felt different. Michael had seen the vulnerability of his father, the way a single misstep could have changed everything. For John, this was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life. For Michael, it was a reminder that courage and care must go hand in hand. Over the next few days, John spent time repairing the areas along the ravine path that had shifted or become unstable. He worked slowly, carefully, paying close attention to every rock and patch of soil. It was hard, exhausting work, but it allowed him to reflect on what had happened and to think about what could have gone wrong. He realized that even the smallest miscalculation could have led to a tragedy, and he vowed to never let pride cloud his judgment again. Neighbors soon learned of John's near accident. Some came by the ranch bringing tools, food, and words of encouragement. Mr. Simmons arrived as well, his face a mixture of relief and gentle reprimand. "I told you, John," he said softly, "you can't fight nature. Not completely. It's not about being strong or brave. It's about being smart." John smiled weakly, accepting the advice with humility. "I know, Mr. Simmons," he said. "Today I learned the hard way that you were right. I've been stubborn, thinking I could handle everything myself, but that isn't true. Experience helps, yes, but respect for the land and its dangers is more important than pride." As the days passed, John's reflection deepened. He spent quiet evenings on the porch, watching the sunset over the fields, thinking about the ravine and the near disaster. He realized that the event had changed more than just his approach to the land. It had changed the way he thought about life itself. He understood that taking risks could be necessary, but blind confidence could be dangerous. True courage, he reflected, was not the absence of fear. It was the ability to recognize danger and act wisely despite it. John also began sharing his story with friends and neighbors in small gatherings. He didn't tell it as a tale of heroism or adventure, but as a lesson learned. "I made a mistake," he would say, "and I was lucky to survive it. I want others to understand that pride and overconfidence can be dangerous. We can't control everything, no matter how experienced we are."
The community listened, learning from his experience. Some nodded knowingly, having faced their own challenges on the land.
Others were surprised by the honesty and humility John displayed. His story became a quiet reminder that even the strongest, most skilled people could be vulnerable if they ignored caution and failed to respect nature's power. John also took time to reflect privately on his relationship with Michael. The boy's concern had touched him deeply, and he realized that protecting his family was just as important as mastering the land. He promised himself that he would always listen more carefully to warnings, not just from the land, but from the people who cared about him. Respect, he understood, applied to both the world around him and the relationships he valued most. Weeks went by, and the ranch slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The fences were repaired, the fields tended, and the daily routines continued. Yet John carried the lessons of the ravine with him every day. When he walked the property, he paid closer attention to the soil, the rocks, and the changes in the land. He knew that the ravine would always be a dangerous place, and he treated it with caution and respect from that day forward. Even Buck, the loyal horse, seemed to sense the change. The animal moved more carefully along paths that were near the ravine, and John often whispered words of encouragement to him, aware of the trust and partnership that had saved them both. They had faced danger together, and the bond between them had grown even stronger as a result. In the evenings, John would sometimes sit quietly, thinking about the narrow escape, the lessons learned, and the fragile balance between pride and humility. The experience had been frightening, exhausting, and humbling, but it had also taught him more about life, nature, and human strength than years of work could have. He realized that survival was not just about skill. It was about respect, patience, and understanding the limits of one's own abilities. By the time the weeks had passed, John had fully recovered from the ordeal, both physically and emotionally, yet the memory of the ravine remained vivid in his mind, a constant reminder of the day he had faced the edge and lived to reflect on his mistakes. He had survived, but he had changed. The pride that had once driven him to challenge the ravine without hesitation had been tempered by humility, respect, and careful thought. John Harris knew that the experience would stay with him forever. He had learned that courage was more than action. It was wisdom. He had learned that experience could guide, but respect must lead. And he had learned that even the strongest, most skilled people could be vulnerable if they ignored caution and failed to listen to warnings. As the ranch settled into its quiet rhythm, John continued to share his story with others, not as a tale of adventure, but as a lesson in humility, caution, and respect for life. He spoke to friends, neighbors, and even strangers who came to visit, emphasizing the importance of paying attention to warnings, thinking carefully, and valuing the trust and care of those around them. Through this reflection, John Harris grew in ways that skill and experience alone could never teach. The ravine had been dangerous, yes, but it had also been a teacher. It had shown him that survival required more than courage. It required wisdom, humility, and an understanding of one's own limits. And in that lesson, John found a deeper sense of respect for the land, for life, and for the people he loved. The weeks and months following John Harris's near disaster at the ravine passed quietly on the ranch, but the events of that day remained vivid in his mind. Each morning as he stepped out into the fields, he remembered the loose rocks, the narrow path, and the fear that had gripped him when Buck had stumbled near the edge. That memory, though frightening, had become a guide, a lesson he carried with him every day. It reminded him that the land, as familiar as it might seem, held dangers that could appear without warning. John had changed in subtle but important ways. His confidence remained, but it was tempered now with caution. He no longer saw the ranch as a place he could dominate or control completely. Instead, he approached it with respect, understanding that survival depended as much on awareness and patience as on skill and strength. He inspected fences, repaired fields, and checked on the livestock with care, taking time to observe the signs the land provided. Every small detail mattered, and he had learned to pay attention to them all. One afternoon, John decided to revisit the ravine, not to challenge it, but to study it carefully. He wanted to understand what had nearly led to disaster and to make sure that others on the ranch would be safe. Buck followed him, moving steadily along the safer paths he had marked earlier. As they approached the edge, John felt a familiar tension, but this time it was accompanied by respect rather than fear. He knelt to examine the soil and the rocks, noting which areas were unstable and which could hold weight safely. The experience from months ago guided every decision he made. John began making small adjustments along the ravine's edge, securing loose stones, marking treacherous patches with sticks, and even creating small steps where the slope had become too sharp. It was careful, patient work, but he found satisfaction in it. He realized that the ravine, once a symbol of danger and challenge, could now become a place of learning. He could share his knowledge with others, teaching them how to navigate the land safely without taking unnecessary risks. As the sun rose higher, John reflected on the lessons he had learned. Courage was not about rushing forward blindly or proving oneself stronger than nature. True courage, he now understood, was about understanding limits, respecting danger, and taking thoughtful actions. He had faced the ravine and survived, but he had done so through careful observation, calm thinking, and trust in his partnership with Buck. Word of John's experience had spread quietly through the nearby town. Farmers, neighbors, and even friends from distant ranches came to visit, curious to hear his story. They expected tales of daring heroism, of a man narrowly escaping death. But John spoke differently. He didn't boast of his bravery or skill. Instead, he told them about caution, respect, and humility.
I made a mistake, John said during one visit, speaking to a small group of listeners on his porch.
I thought experience alone would keep me safe. I thought I could control everything. But the land doesn't work that way. The ravine taught me that even the strongest people can be vulnerable. Listen to warnings. Pay attention. Respect the land and those who care about you. That is the true measure of courage. The neighbors listened intently, nodding in agreement. Some shared their own stories of brushes with danger, while others expressed relief that John had survived. His words resonated deeply, not because they were dramatic, but because they were honest. John had learned something important and was willing to share it openly. Michael, his son, often accompanied him during these talks. The boy had grown through the experience as well, understanding that courage and wisdom were connected. He watched his father with pride, noticing the patience and care in his actions, the respect he showed for the land, and the way he shared his lessons with others. Michael realized that true strength was not about ignoring danger. It was about understanding it and acting responsibly. Even at home, the lessons from the ravine influenced daily life. John and Michael worked together more closely, discussing plans, checking conditions, and making decisions as a team. The ranch became safer, more organized, and more thoughtful. John still took risks as a rancher must, but they were calculated, measured, and respectful of both nature and human limits. Over time, John found that the ravine had given him more than fear and caution. It had given him perspective. He could appreciate the beauty and power of the land without feeling compelled to dominate it recklessly. He could guide others, teaching them not only about survival, but about respect for life and the environment. And he could reflect on his own choices, understanding that mistakes could teach lessons far more valuable than pride ever could. One day, as John and Michael rode along the ranch boundary, they stopped near the edge of the ravine. John looked down into the canyon, where the stream sparkled like silver and the plants clung stubbornly to the rocks. He remembered the day he had slipped, the terror he had felt, and the relief when he had finally regained stable ground. But now he felt something different, a quiet gratitude. He was alive. He had survived, and he had learned lessons that would last a lifetime. "Dad," Michael said softly, breaking the silence, "I understand now. Courage isn't just about doing something dangerous. It's about thinking carefully and making the right choices, even when it's hard." John smiled and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Exactly, Michael. You've learned it well. Remember, it's not always about being the bravest. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is be careful and wise." In the evenings, John continued to share his story with neighbors and visitors, recounting the events of the ravine and the lessons he had learned. His tale was no longer just a story of danger. It had become a story of wisdom, humility, and respect. People left his ranch not only impressed by his experience, but inspired by the thoughtful approach he had taken to life after facing near disaster. As the seasons changed, John noticed something remarkable. The ravine, which had once been a symbol of fear and challenge, now became a place of reflection and understanding. He would walk along the safer paths, observing the soil, the plants, and the wildlife. He appreciated the way the ravine shaped the land and the life it supported. The beauty that had once seemed intimidating now inspired respect, a reminder that nature's power was something to honor rather than conquer. John Harris had survived the edge of the ravine, but he had gained more than survival. He had gained insight, wisdom, and humility. He had learned that experience was valuable, but respect and careful thinking were even more important. He had learned that courage included patience, observation, and understanding, and that pride could sometimes blind even the most skilled person. He had also learned the value of relationships. The concern of Michael, the warnings of Mr. Simmons, and the support of neighbors had all contributed to his survival and growth. John realized that life was not meant to be faced alone. Trusting others, listening to advice, and valuing guidance were as important as skill and strength. By the end of that year, John Harris had transformed in subtle yet profound ways. His ranch was thriving, but more importantly, so was he. He moved with patience and awareness, treated his land with care, and shared his knowledge freely.